And I want to introduce my three guests, and that we're going to talk about. Really, we're going to continue with the discussion around the future. But in this case, we're going to be talking what is listed here in terms of global security, climate change, from warfare to extinction. And my own kind of expertise is around kind of emergent warfare and what that means for societies and militaries and the environment and things like this. And so it's not wholly dissimilar. But in fact, despite the fact that I've already given you a recommendation, you won't be hearing much from me. And in fact, what you're going to be hearing is much more in the context of, in the first instance, it's Denis Kierans, who's researcher at at COMPAS, the Center on Migration Policy and Society at the University of Oxford. And from 2014 to 2019, before arriving there, he held various positions at the International Organization for Migration, and in particular his work on both kind of the data and policy angles around migration. Next, we have Chad Briggs. Chad Briggs is someone I've known for a very long time, Director of Graduate Public Policy and Administration Programs and Associate Professor of Public Policy at the University of Alaska Anchorage. For the past 4 years, Chad has been in Kosovo working at the American University in Kosovo as a professor of public policy. And then since 2010, Chad has been the strategy director at Global Interconnection LLC, working at the Minerva Defense Fellow at the Office of Security of Defense and beyond. At the U.S. Air Force Air University. And then finally, we have Jessica Hope, who's the Vice Chancellor's Research Fellow, School of Geographical Sciences at the University of Bristol. Her current research, funded by a Royal Geographical Society Environment and Sustainability Grant, investigates reiterations of sustainable development as it fits within the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. I think that's good. What I really want to do is just hand it over to Denis and get us started. Thank you very much.
Hello, am I heard loud and clear? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in Bath for the first time. I've been asked to speak a little bit about environmental migration, what that means. So I'm going to provide basically an overview of the situation. The idea is to create a kind of an inroad for you to make connections between your work and your areas of expertise and this phenomenon. Oh yeah, we're all geared up here. All right, so what do the figures tell us? Well, on average, we have about 24 million newly displaced people every year due to disasters. And on this graph behind me, we see columns representing the number of newly displaced people per year, and the line representing the number of documented disasters. We see in 2008, 2010, and 2012, relatively few disasters recorded, but incredibly high levels of displaced persons. And we also see that since 2014, and especially most recently in 2017 and 2018, really close to the opposite seems to be the case. But this doesn't necessarily mean that progress is being made on tackling the issue of environmental migration. These figures do not tell us, for example, the length of time these people are displaced or were displaced, if they still are displaced, if this displacement led them to safety or to further exposure, if actions are being taken to build resilience. These figures don't say if these actions were responsible for the lower number of newly displaced, and they don't say or tell us anything about people who may have moved for a reason that isn't explicitly and solely tied to an environmental disaster. They do signal potentially improved data collection methods, and they may also signal fewer large-scale disasters. do not account for the complexity of the drivers of migration, why people migrate, nor do they account for the different types of environmental migration, the different types of environmental changes, for example. And that's really typical. A lot of the analysis in this area focuses a lot on individuals who are fleeing from disasters. The problem with this is it leaves out a lot of people. It leaves out people who may move due to slow onset changes. And it rules out people who may move for a combination of reasons, which it turns out are most people. Environmental threats are really rarely the sole driver of migration. So for example, when damage to the oceans, for example, has weakened tourism in an area that may have previously focused on the great coral reefs and scuba diving or something, it may cause people who previously worked in that industry, in the tourism industry, and related industries, to move elsewhere. When they're asked about why they moved, they may say to find a better job, and that's also true. Others may later move because of the resulting social and demographic changes which sort of change the way of life. The poorest of the poor, especially vulnerable populations, they may be trapped in this environment now that poses increasing risks on a range of fronts. The environment is getting worse. There are economic and environmental issues, resource scarcity, political instability are all issues that can really foment in these situations. So what we call environmental migration should be understood to encompass all of these understandings and all these implications. It should also be viewed as encompassing the different types of migration. International, so people who cross an international border from one country to another. Internal, people who are moving from one village to another village, or most frequently, is most often the case today, from rural areas to urban areas. Forced migrants, as well as those who are left behind in the area that they live in by people who emigrated. And those who are hosting migrant populations now, who've moved to their cities or villages for any number of reasons. So in this way, it has potential to impact a range of sectors: economical, social, political, demographic, and even environmental itself. And not just in areas experiencing the brunt of environmental changes, because people don't just move to these areas, they move to other areas. So the many terms that you often see sort of bandied in public debate, used in research and policy circles, which I have up there on the board: climate, refugee, environmentally displaced persons, disaster displacement. These are, in ways, reflections of how people are thinking about environmental migration and the emphasis that they're placing on it. So, with all this in mind, generating predictions as to the effects of the environment on migration and other areas such as resource depletion, conflict, they're very difficult. We see some correlation between, for example, disasters and conflict displacement, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's the map that I have up there, where the blue slice of the pie, if you will, represents displacement due to disaster in 2018, new displacements due to disaster in 2018, and the orange represents new displacements due to conflicts. We know that there are interactions between these two events, and that they often converge. But the particular ways that they interact, and especially interact moving forward, remain rather unclear and difficult to disentangle. Slow onset environmental change and disasters are also thought to most affect the regions that are the least developed and have populations that are less resilient to the changes. So these regions that are already set up in such a way that they are rather exposed also to suffer from weak governance. So the ability for the governments to react or plan policy around these issues is also difficult. So it's both a pressing matter in terms of these regions and an incredibly difficult one to surmount. Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America represent over half of the developing world's population. This bottom chart describes some efforts on the part of World Bank to consider 3 scenarios for estimating how many people will be forced to move due to climate change by 2050. The yellow columns represent the pessimistic outlook, which is essentially continued high greenhouse gas emissions combined with unequal development. So basically, essentially the status quo. Things aren't really changing one way or the other. The teal represents more inclusive development. So the same pathway of emissions, but more inclusive development plans successfully rolled out globally and especially in these regions. And then light green, takes into account more climate-friendly scenarios. So lower global emissions, but no change really to the development plans, still unequal development pathways. And so we can see how without change to how development is approached, and without serious restrictions on greenhouse gases, climate change is predicted to force 143 million people from these regions, almost 3% of the population, to move. From these different scenarios, we have 2 main lessons that can be taken. Development action is not enough on its own, and it should be combined with greenhouse gas reduction, which seems to be, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, more important on the whole. But also, too, the second main lesson I guess you could take from this is that action is within reach. There is a path charted forward. That's perfect. So, how are people dealing with this? What are some of the ways to maybe take action on this? There are policy responses. So, reducing greenhouse gases as per the Paris Agreement is one way that is what is baked into the scenario, the light green scenario. That is the impact, as predicted by World Bank, of the Paris Accord being followed through at a global level. We also know that political will is sometimes in short supply. Not every country is a signatory to the Paris Accord, for example. And we see as well that there's an increasing share of the world's economy and population at the city level, in cities, living in cities. And that city governments and mayors are on the front lines and often are able to deal with problems on a smaller scale more effectively. So there are, in terms of reducing greenhouse gases, another example that may be quite promising, be things like Big Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, as well as other city-based initiatives. Another policy response that's recommended, again, just illustrative examples, would be to link environment and migration more closely into development planning. So I believe we'll hear more about the Sustainable Development Goals and how that links in later on. But just to say that, of course, there are a number of targets that implicate migration as well as the environment. The Global Compact for Migration as well is another sort of global framework which takes into account deteriorating environments, and countries who've signed on to that have taken a commitment to prevent these people from having to move away from deteriorating environments through irregular migration. And local level planning as well, to build up actual development policies at the city level, is for climate migrants or environmental migrants, again, is especially important because cities are not just taking on more people in having a larger share of the world's population, having a larger share of the world's economy. These people are also migrants, and they have a larger proportional share of migrants in the world living in cities. So again, they're very well positioned to contend with a lot of the issues of migrants who oftentimes are moving from precarious situations in rural areas to cities where they may have better opportunities for jobs, security, healthcare, etc., and may find more resilience there. Finally, improving understanding and essentially research responses. So I talked a little bit about the initial issues with the data, what the data don't show us, what the data hide. So there's a lot of room for improvement on this area through research and convening things, for example, like what we're doing now. Briefly say at Oxford, we're running at Compass, we're running a research program across China, Colombia, India, South Africa, and in the UK. And the idea is to build up systems of knowledge, build up data collection systems and interpretation of the data to understand, especially in places where the pace of urban change is the greatest, where resources are the most stretched or the most limited, and where governance is complicated, is to try and build up systems for understanding how cities can actually pull together development plans that are based on some concept of data analysis, some sort of evidence base. So just to conclude, better understanding and communication of the information would help to inform political action. Sorry, I just quit smoking 2 weeks ago and something's happening. Oh, thanks. The goal, however, should not be to stop migration. Migration is an adaptation strategy for a number of reasons, economically, but especially in the context of environmental disaster. Migration could be encouraged by governments, by policy makers. Examples such as welcoming centers in nearby cities, the portability of social services can encourage people to leave situations that are harming them. But there's also a need to do more than just planning for the worst and dealing with it after the fact. Investment in industries and sectors that are less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change would help more durable lifestyles. Investment in human capital, et cetera, et cetera. The list can go on, you can probably imagine. Essentially that there is room to avert potential disaster by building a stronger understanding of environmental migration, its impacts and its drivers, as well as acting to increase political will to turn that research into some kind of action. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denis, for that. We're going to continue on the environment theme. So over to you, Chad.
Thank you. Is this on now?
Chad,
no? We're not sure.
Yes, I do.
Just click through.
No, that's not mine.
No? Keep clicking. Yeah, that's the front of mine. Oh, is it different? Yeah.
Okay. Well, sorting out technical details. I'd worked for the U.S. military long enough that it actually became in vogue to not use PowerPoint. It was really, really edgy not to have a 100-slide PowerPoint presentation or briefing. So follow on from Martin and Denis, I was reminded of an old academic joke that a scientist came out of a lab late at night and saw one of his colleagues on his hands and knees in the dark but underneath the streetlight, and came up and asked, well, what are you looking for? He said, well, I've lost my keys. I lost them over there in the car park. I looked over and said, well, then why aren't you looking over in the car park? He said, what, you crazy? It's dark over there. This is the only place I can see. And it's not a good joke, but it illustrates so much of what we, either as academics or policymakers, do wrong, is that we look at those places that are easiest to see, and we follow on our understandings of things because we don't want to complicate the world. There's probably no better example of this, at least in my field, than climate change. Climate change complicates things. It is not the main driver, as Denis said, of what happens, either in terms of migration or in disasters, but it is always there, and it's increasingly there, and it is pushing everything else. That just like in other security planning, for years and years, people had just assumed that conflict in Europe was going to be between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. It was going to happen on the plains of Germany, and that was the environment. And they didn't plan for anything differently. And it makes it very difficult to shift people's thinking and to think about what the world is really going to be like once that environment changes. So the other thing I just need to, because I only have a few minutes, to emphasize is that the popular understanding of why climate change is a security issue, why is the military interested in this? In particular, you've all heard the stories about how the US military is interested in this, despite the White House telling them, no, you can't talk about this. Last year, well, 2 years ago, the Trump White House removed 70 references to climate change in the National Defense Strategy because they just didn't want to talk about it. But the military persisted. And it wasn't, though, the way that it popularly comes out in terms of people saying, well, climate change led to the civil war in Syria, or climate change leads to more instability, because that's not what the Pentagon's interested in. That's not how they see things, and that's not how we should see things. So speaking as a former insider, and I say former because what we do is not very in vogue with the current people living in the White House, the concept of climate security differs from how the universities tend to see it. And we break it down into three ways. First of all, we look at it in terms of changing the strategic environment. In other words, we're going to be operating in places we didn't operate before. There is no sea ice in the Arctic right now. One of my colleagues went in the icebreaker off of North Alaska this summer. They didn't find ice. That's not supposed to happen. So just changing, as one admiral said, well, we have a whole new ocean there. We're going to have to deal with this sort of new environment. It also changes operations, meaning whether it just means that you're going to be operating in a place that's hotter, you're going to be operating in new places, that they're going to be humanitarian and disaster operations. And those are, for the Pentagon's point of view, disasters are an operational concern, meaning they will make the argument that, look, if we show up, if the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Unit shows up in your backyard because of some climate-related issue, we're not going to solve that, right? It's too late already. So we view this as an operational concern, but you have to view this differently. Meaning, the third point, that it's a human security issue. This has nothing to do with violence. We once gave a presentation to a group of flag officers saying about, well, here are reasons why water conflict between, or tensions between China and India could lead to a conflict. And they listened politely and they said, all right, we'll put that about number 20 on the list of reasons why China and India could go to war with one another. That, like Denis said, is complicated, right? It's not the one driver. You always have to look at it in the larger context of things. But it's important to point out to the other people and say, look, this is still important. People are going to be harmed by this. If it means that the Bahamas are going to be flattened by a hurricane, if it means that Puerto Rico will be flattened, if it means that the Amazon is going to be burned up by a combination of not just environmental changes, but changes to tariffs and changes to trade and changes to the political regime in Brazil. Those things are still important, but there is not a military solution to that. So it's a security issue, but you have to start much further back and then start tracing out what are the points at which this becomes interesting to us and then make it not interesting to us anymore. Don't wait until the military really starts getting interested in this and has to respond, because we have no good response. And that meant then that what we had to do was do scenario planning, to work backwards, to say these are the potential futures, and then work back from that and say we don't want to just focus on the spotlight of this is violent conflict, because then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But to say, at what point do we have cooperation? At what point do we build partnerships? At what point do we do good things so that, and not we speaking as the military, but other agencies, other partners, so that we don't get to those really bad outcomes. And that's what I was charged with focusing on for a number of years. And it was really wonderful work, but challenging because it meant translating a lot of scientific data and dealing with a lot of uncertainty. So we get pulled in different directions. On the left, you have a NASA satellite photo that was superimposed on the vulnerability analysis of the Bahamas. There's an incredible amount of data that can tell us what disaster impacts or vulnerabilities could exist under different scenarios. We have an enormous amount of information available to us. But at the same time, do I have to explain this photo on the right? I'm sure many of you heard about the Sharpie. So the certain White House occupant decided to not back down and to change the weather forecasts. And then to force the National Weather Service to change its views of things. This is really blown up as a big issue in the United States, at least in certain circles, in terms of weather forecasting, climate scientists, because what it represents in terms of interfering in the trusted institutions, that it's not just Trump blowing out old Western institutions like NATO, but if it's trusted institutions like scientific ability to predict, that's really a security issue in terms of who do we trust them? Who do we go to? What information do we look at? And then how do we deal with that uncertainty? We have to deal with uncertainty already, but if people are deliberately inserting uncertainty into situations, then that comes back to, to how I know David originally, which is things like information warfare in Ukraine. These are not things we should be having to deal with.
3 minutes.
Okay. So the general background is that we tend to think in linear terms. In other words, we like straight lines. We like to think that things will grow gradually over time. We like to think that tomorrow will pretty much be like today, just more so. But the reality, of course, is that there are critical changes. There are tipping points in systems. There are points at which, if certain vulnerable points in a system are overrun, if they're overwhelmed, it completely changes the nature of the system. New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, was not the same city as it was before. The Japanese energy system after Fukushima and the 2011 tsunami was not the same system. And these were vulnerabilities that could have been identified in advance and could have been shored up. So if we can identify these things in advance, if we can understand that there are fragile systems, there are places in which, whether it's a natural system that it gets beyond a certain point and then it starts getting worse and worse, and if we could stop that ahead of time, what causes a community to start to leave? What causes an ecosystem to start to shut down? And to understand that, and then to focus then on those vulnerable points, rather than just trying to do everything at once, but instead to say these are where we need to invest most. And then to identify the uncertainties. This is not what we're taught to do at universities. We're taught to focus on what we know and then move a little bit beyond that. But to go out then into the darkness and then just to say, these are the types of uncertainty we have, this is why we have this uncertainty, this is why we don't know these things, and to understand that that can actually tell us a great deal about risks. You don't get rewarded for that at universities either. And it's a little difficult for my students because they still have to write papers and they still have to cite their sources, but at the same time, they can't come up to their final exam and then say, well, I don't know this, and these are the reasons why I don't know the answer to this question. But it's still important, and much of our work in the intelligence community was writing dark reports. In other words, saying, this is what we don't know yet about climate science, this is what we don't know about the Greenland ice sheet, these are the reasons why we don't know it, this is why it wasn't communicated to the UNFCCC, and these are the implications of not knowing these things. These are the risks that could emerge because those risks were not communicated. And if we don't look at these things, if we try to ignore what's going to be inevitable, then we end up in much worse situations. Australia has had this problem for years. They have felt climate impacts before many of the other places on Earth. The Arctic has been experiencing this. I'm new to Alaska. It should have been cold and rainy all of last month. It was hot and it didn't rain a single time. The city of Anchorage was covered in smoke the entire month. And I'm sorry for jumping through this quickly, but I could explain a bit more in questions. And it means that in Alaska, where we have climate change moving twice as fast as it does in other places, this summer we were experiencing temperatures that were about 5 degrees Celsius above average. And to an ecosystem, that's extraordinary. It means melting permafrost. It means wildfires on infrastructure. When they built the Alaska pipeline, they did not plan for having wildfire. I mean, it's not supposed to burn. It's supposed to be frozen much of the time. And it means then that those assumptions that we had, that there will always be oil and gas coming from Alaska, that there will always be villages on the western and north shore, and those villages don't exist anymore, and the pipeline is under threat. We have to start reassessing all of our old assumptions about how we get our energy, where it comes from, what happens to these communities, what it means for, say, indigenous communities, which have historically lived in this place for centuries, and then they have to up and leave. Where do they go? What happens to those communities? What happens then to the fabric of that society? And does the state have a responsibility then, not just to try and prevent this from happening, but to help relocate them and to preserve their practices. How do you do that? I mean, we don't have the experts for it yet. And even just starting to train people to do this is a huge challenge. So one of the suggested steps is always give practical steps, so I can't ignore that, right? In the end, we do have to come up with understandable narratives. You can't simply throw data at people. You have to come up with narratives, storytelling that is meaningful for people, that makes sense, that is believable in a way. And talk about what could happen, not just what you think will happen. When we make predictions, we tend to do this linear thinking and then say, this is the one point that I think will happen. But people tend to choose the median. But what happens in environmental systems is that it's not going to be the median. It could be anywhere along the spectrum. And oftentimes it's going to be more extreme than what we expect, especially when all the variables start to interact. So you have to push people. I had diplomats, I had US officials telling me to be quiet and stop talking about hurricane threats and risks to the city of New York, because those things are too improbable and simply won't happen. And then 2 years ago, they did happen. And that was a failing on our part, because we didn't sell the story well enough. People retreated. They were too scared by the idea of lower Manhattan being flooded. And so they didn't want to believe it, and they chose not to believe it. But if instead we can come out and we can come up with suitable narratives, with practical steps people can do in order to deal with these issues, because otherwise psychologically they retreat. And at the same time, understand the justice concerns that are associated with this, regional, economic, minority, what have you. To understand that in making decisions, there could be as bad dislocations as the actual changes themselves. And that if we can do this, then at least goes part way to understanding how these sort of background factors could be pulling the rug out from underneath us. Thank you. Great.
Thank you very much, Chad. The reason why we've ordered them this way is I really like the fact that in talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and development, it really kind of brings us full circle. So really, over to you.
Great, thank you. Am I on? Oh, yes. So I'm also missing my slides. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Jessica Hope. I am a research fellow at Bristol in the Cabot Institute for the Environment and also the School of Geographical Sciences. And thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm going to maybe slightly change the focus of conflict, less away from sort of the military and securitization concerns, but to the kind of conflicts and contestations over land that emerge in part from conflictive ideas and languages of development and the environment. So to date, my work has pretty much exclusively been in Bolivia. So I'm going to talk to that work today. And my current project looks at development in response to climate change, specifically the contested politics of the take-up of the UN Sustainable Development Goals in Bolivia. So in doing this work, and what I hope to do today is draw out conflicts over natural resources, but in terms of how they are named, valued, used, and protected, how development is being defined and by whom, and why that matters to the kind of conflictive politics of sustainable development, and I guess orientate my talk and work towards concerns for environmental justice. So, following on, and as already mentioned by Chad, I am giving this talk in the context of the burning Amazon. Parts of the Western Amazon are still on fire. And although it's been mostly reported for Brazil, it's happening also in Bolivia. And as Chad also mentioned, these are not natural fires. They are started on purpose. They are supported by changed government policies. And they are driven in part by demands for particular forms of development, productivity, agriculture, and land use. And I think in Brazil, they're possibly not so surprising if you're following Bolsonaro and his explicit claims around productivity in the Amazon region and the way that that's been decried by conservationists and also by those supporting particular indigenous territories and their rights. But in Bolivia, it is perhaps more surprising because for many people in the global north, Evo Morales, our current president, is still seen as a kind of advocate of indigenous rights and progressive socio-environmental agendas. So in 2005, on the back of large-scale, significant social movement mobilizations across the country, mainly led by indigenous groups, Bolivia elected Evo Morales, the world's first self-proclaimed indigenous president. And he was voted in on the back of campaigns for enhanced indigenous rights, including territorial autonomy, so giving much greater forms of power and political power to indigenous groups over their land. On the back of commitments to the environment and very progressive claims around climate change being caused by global capitalism and a kind of global metabolisms for natural resources and economic growth. And commitments to alternative forms of development. So the picture on the top right is a sort of illustration of Bien Vivir, which is Vivir Bien in Bolivia, which some of you may have heard of, which is a sort of alternative development paradigm that was written into the Bolivian constitution in 2009 and articulated in terms of alternative indigenous, taken broadly, knowledges, and in critique of kind of dominant ideas about development that are driven and measured by GDP growth or economic growth broadly. Instead, this is about living well within your community, living well within the natural environment, and trying to decenter what we think of development as based around older ideas about growth. So that was made constitutional in 2009, and since 2015, Bolivia has fully signed up with Morales to the Sustainable Development Goals. And yet, for some of us in the room, we may not be surprised about the forest fires in Bolivia and some of the consternation within civil society that they were not only supported politically through legislative changes, but also have not really been dealt with very swiftly or well. So since 2009, Bolivia has been looked to by academics and activists as a key site of extractivism. So intensifying commitments to the extraction of natural gas and minerals. So Bolivia has huge natural gas wealth, so hydrocarbon wealth, but also minerals, including minerals like lithium. It's part of the lithium triangle that's used for climate change initiatives around, say, electric cars or rechargeable batteries, large-scale batteries. So since 2009, Bolivia is increasingly looked at within academic literatures as much more critically in terms of the state's commitments to extractivism. And the pictures on the left, I'm sorry I don't have a source for this map, I've just realized it's not come off in translation, but I think it's from Denis Kierans. This is just to give you a sense of hydrocarbon exploration in the Western Amazon. These are the blocks for exploration in beige, extraction in yellow. It's unprecedented, the levels of extractivism that are happening over the Western Amazon region still, even now that the resource boom has waned. In the middle, the maps are of road building and new transport infrastructure in Bolivia, and they're just to give a sense that really it's a sort of twofold issue. It's not just about sites of mining and those kind of claims on land and the ways that those new claims on land are overlapping with, say, conservation areas or indigenous territories or pre-existing claims on land. But it's also about the new infrastructure that's required to get there and the huge infrastructure projects that are currently underway in Latin America, partly financed by China, which is becoming an increasingly significant player in Bolivia. So huge new road networks that are going back into Amazon areas that are helping export these resources to regional and global markets. And on the right is a map by Tony Bebbington and others who I know came and spoke here recently, in their project looking at new infrastructure and transport links across the Brazilian Amazon. So I guess the sort of broad point here is that that there are very, very contested claims over land that are really challenging these sort of more progressive ideas about development and nature in response to climate change, even in sites like Bolivia that have made these significant pledges to quite progressive agendas. So sort of reorientating that story in terms of the theme of the future and in terms of today's workshop, I just want to talk to two questions. So the first question is, how are things known, named, and valued, and by whom? And this refers to, a very fertile and strong set of debates within social sciences, geography, anthropology, that's looking at political ontology, the kind of politics of knowledges and the diversity of knowledges that exist in terms of, in this case, or in the case of my work, in the case of much of the work actually, the non-human world, and why it matters about how we know what nature, for starters, is. So there's a lot of work being done, especially in the Latin American context, around decolonizing how nature is understood, termed, and known. So thinking about the different ways, the fact that, nature, trying to take down nature-culture binaries, trying to rethink how we relate to the non-human world, trying to take seriously other people's ways of knowing and living with their world as a response to climate change. And I think that this is also being taken up as quite an instructive way forward through an environmental crisis, which is to try and go against, for example, terms like natural resources, which already are setting out a term that's about appropriating and exploiting the non-human world for, say, hydrocarbon markets and transnational interests. And also, of course, in terms of development, reorientating what we mean. Is sustainable development a long critiqued, already kind of trashed term, but now reiterated in global policy? Does it even encompass some of these diverse and contested interpretations about what development is, for example, with Vivir Bien? And then the second question, which is really rooted in environmental justice debates, which is, who has access to and control over land, and why does that change? So in my work, a lot of my entry point has often been, indigenous territorial movements, and then their relationship to, say, global development policies and networks, as well as the state. And I guess, whereas climate justice might be looking at the huge injustices and disparities broadly between who pollutes and who deals with the consequences, although that is now, I guess, well, anyway, yes. Environmental justice is increasingly concerned with who has access to and control over land, and the kind of why that matters in terms of these kind of contested politics over how nature and development is seen and understood and treated and protected. And also because it slightly sort of explains conflict differently, I guess, which is actually conflict over the kind of increasing and continuing thirst for natural resources or exploitation that's driving significant degradation in the Amazonian region, and the significant breaking down of existing social and environmental protections. So, yes, just to end, I guess, on these questions, I guess for me, the social and political responses to climate change are crucial, and very, very conflictive. And I think the work of social science is really important in trying to understand and probably do more of your dark reporting on, if we know the science, what are the responses, and what are the huge challenges that this brings to entrenched sites of power and capital. And I think these two questions can be a helpful guide through some of these debates that are trying to find a pathway through. Thank you.
I think what's interesting for me is really talking about the discussion here around, say, the environment or around migration, and talking about them in ways that actually seems quite different from the way that we hear our policymakers and the media talk about them in a way. And I would, in a sense, suggest that in a sense that we aren't ignoring those, in a sense, very heavy hegemonic narratives in any way, but but there's something distinct about what's coming out here. I think we've seen interesting kind of introduction into the notion of how we may talk about these things in terms of like a black analysis, and this idea, and the contemporary philosopher Zizek often talked about the known unknowns. That there are unknowns, there are things out there, that actually that we know about, but we're not allowed to talk about. And it's because it doesn't fit a power structure, and it's very interesting because even if we do have the data and we can explain, somehow that still doesn't affect or influence or inform policy in any way. So tying it back to the IPR. But what I would really like to do is open it up for questions. We have about 17 minutes for questions, so over to you. Please, Susan.
Hello, thank you very much for those comments and ideas. Maybe this question is particularly for Chad.
Susan, could you tell us who you are?
Sorry, I'm a senior lecturer in international development here at the university. I'm wondering whether one of the known unknowns is what Bruno Latour and others call the politics of the armed lifeboat, and whether maybe particularly Chad would like to comment on the extent to which in the kinds of scenarios that are being discussed in the military. I think it's really fascinating to hear that perspective, whether this kind of underlying idea of who's trying to shore up their chances of survival is evident in any way, and how that actually is being carried through.
There's a very long history of that sort of imagery, which I would argue is very colonial. The idea of here are the white people and the dark people are over there, and if they come here, they need permission, even though we didn't really ask permission to go over there in the first place. And there's a lot of that in the early environmental security literature in the 1990s. Robert Kaplan, Connolly and Kennedy, and a lot of it's resurfaced. You see it in the EU's discussion about what to do with migrants from coming over from Turkey into Greece. You see it even just this week. The Trump administration just suddenly changed the rules for Bahama residents and said that they're not allowed to take refuge in Florida, even though traditionally they'd be able to do so, and put it under a security rubric, excuse, right, saying that, well, there are lots of gangs and drug dealers in Bahama. There aren't, but that's used as an excuse, and this is problematic because the securitization of these issues is something that, interestingly, inside the Pentagon they didn't like. They didn't like these sorts of arguments because they didn't want to get dragged into it. They viewed these as overly political. And it's dangerous because, as well, you can make arguments that, for example, if you say that, well, these refugees are the result of climate change. If you make that argument, then it's almost as if you're saying, well, there's nothing we can do then. Right? It's out of our hands, so we have no responsibility anymore. Or this conflict was caused by climate change, so it's not our fault. We had nothing, sure, we sold $1 billion of weapons to these people, but that was incidental. It papers over so much of the important issues. And I think the sort of critical geography of really looking at, how were these constructed in the first place? That's still really important. So even though, I had this sort of professional question of should I be working in this field? Should I be working with these people? But in a lot of ways I found that it was more open than a lot of places at the university, which never bothered to look back and question all of their assumptions about political scientists in the US always thinking that conflict is important, that's what we should study. And well, no, that's actually not what we should be looking at.
Any other questions? Please.
Question for Joe, really, about the use of terms, natural capital approaches and ecosystem services and that sort of stuff. How do you feel about them?
Well, I got interested in Bolivia because I was interested in Morales's and the social movement agendas for post-neoliberalism and plurinationalism. Plurinationalism now akin to kind of decolonizing agendas around understanding diversity and pluriversality and post-neoliberalism in the context of the environment. And for me, I was interested because I was working in, studying in Manchester with a guy called Professor Dan Brockington, who worked on neoliberalized conservation and was actually very critical of what happens when you start to value nature only in market terms, and what that means, I guess, discursively in terms of how we understand and then protect and then write policy around the environment, and also empirically in terms of actually environmental outcomes and data, which don't really support those kind of terminologies or initiatives. And also, I suppose, actually going back to environmental justice, what it also means in terms of who ends up owning and controlling, say, forests in the Amazon basin. So for me, I find them hugely problematic, and that's what spurred interest in the kind of attempts to know things and say things differently.
Great. There was one down here as well.
Yeah, quite a simple question, maybe a difficult answer. How do we become better at telling the stories in order to get the movement that's needed? You referred to one or two problems in that area.
I don't have an easy answer to that. It's not something they train us to do at the universities. And what I encountered, especially when I worked for the Department of Energy, much of my work was outreach, like outreach to scientists. And what many of them said was that, look, I have my job, and they pay me to publish in these journals, but I can only publish in the journals if it passes peer review, so it has to have the 95% confidence interval, and that is this much of what I know about the subject. All this other stuff that I know, all the things that I'm really worried about, I can't talk about. I don't get rewarded for talking about it. In fact, professionally, I can be sanctioned for, for scaring people, for things that I can't substantiate. And graduate students and younger faculty were especially concerned about this because they wanted to be active. They study environmental issues because they're worried about the environment. And they go to places like Peru and they see what's happening to Andean glaciers. And, so I think if universities can open up the space, if they can find other venues that institutionally they can be rewarded for, and that's the key thing. Don't punish young faculty for writing blogs or for being socially active or for engaging themselves. I mean, I was, admittedly, this was an intelligence office for the Department of Energy, but of course we didn't tell them that because, then immediately people jumped to the conclusion, oh, you're CIA and this is bad, and I can't, for understandable reasons. They would work with certain offices, but they didn't want to work with others. And if they felt that this was being used for security purposes, then they would worry about it and they would start to clam up a bit. So there's also a disconnect between the government and the people in academia. That maybe they'll have certain inroads into government and they can tell stories to certain people, but sometimes the people who really need to hear these things don't hear them. And that's different, of course, in every culture and every institutional setup. But I have seen some good practices in some places, but definitely what's happening in the U.S. now, we're not allowed to tell any stories.
Can I just jump in a bit, just on something that Chad, just to sort of support what you were saying about early career. I mean, as an early career researcher who is working on broadly climate change, I am very interested and do engage with kind of trying to communicate differently or to different groups, work with NGOs, work with organizations, think about how the university can better communicate, say, with activists. But also as an early career, I'm trapped in this job market where none of that is valued at all. And actually, all I'm assessed on is papers to high-ranking academic journals. And that is really tricky. That is a huge institutional problem, I think, that I guess you can just ignore, but also is, for me, but is definitely hard.
Yeah, just to kind of pile onto that a little bit. My experience is not at all in the academy until very recently, and it's coming much more from trying to target policymakers and as well as information campaigns more so to the general public, and not in regarding in the environment or climate change so much as migration. But all that being said, just some things that some potential lessons of, first of all, of course, like understanding the audience. Like the Sustainable Development Goals is a great example of a way of communicating that is great for the policy world and has absolutely very little purchase outside of that to the general public. I think that you can see that some audiences will be more receptive to certain communication styles, if we're talking about this way. So, and certain types of information lend themselves better to certain communication styles. So, whether or not an emotional appeal is, for example, ideal, or whether or not it should be used in combination with facts or figures or other things. So, I guess I'm saying this out of a place of now working with UK cities to develop inclusive narratives within their cities, and working with them on developing narratives for their cities so that people generally believe it. And the way that we need to talk and address the policymakers to implement those narratives is very different than the narratives that we actually end up creating for the general population. So, just to say that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question. I mean, yesterday we were all here inundated by Operation Yellowhammer, which was this release of the government's response to a no-deal Brexit, and of course, it's difficult to be a civil servant and try to tell the government that you think that the policy is going to have a negative effect on a certain kind of area of the economy or society in some ways. So it is telling truth to power, which was original purpose and still is a purpose of the institute, is something that I think that we're very interested in not only kind of speaking in service to, but also kind of figuring out of how do we go about trying to do that. And of course, strategies that we would have had to convey our expertise to policymakers, that's changing, and it's becoming more hostile. And I'm not the only person here that when the taxi driver asks me what I do, I come up with another profession very quickly, just so I don't have to deal with the questions and sometimes hostility. So one of the things that really occurs to me is that we've really kind of talked about the problems, and we haven't talked a lot about solutions other than really addressing the how do we tell policymakers what we think is going to happen without being punished? And in the environmental studies literature, there's a great deal of kind of discussion around kind of three approaches to solutions. And one of those is kind of the technological approach, what I often refer to as the romantic approach. The technological approach that technology will solve us and we'll be able to take carbon out of the air and sink it and everything will be okay, and we'll be able to maybe have large freezers where we can grow new ice and things like this, and everything will be all right. And we'll still have polar bears, etc. The other is the kind of the rationalist argument that kind of hits somewhere in between, and that if we can get everyone to agree to the Paris Agreement and we can just achieve and we can hold on to the Amazon and to and other things, we're going to lose things, but maybe we can save things. And then you have the radical approach. That is there's something pathological about our world economy as it is, or our modes of production. There's something pathological about all these things. Even the way that we talk about resources, as natural resources, as you pointed out, and all these things, in a sense, require all these three different approaches: the romantic, the rationalist, and the radical. as my old colleague Ingelfor Bludorn probably would have called them, is something that actually is very difficult for us to imagine how those are going to solve the environmental problems of the environment or the non-human world, the environmental problems in terms of the instability, whether that's in a sense future conflicts or land conflicts or migration. I just wonder, and across those kind of three areas, how you understand your kind of areas.
Where I'd fit myself on that.
Yeah.
Shall I kick off?
Yeah.
Well, I think I would sit myself in the radical part of it.
I thought so.
Partly because I just think we need it. Like, I agree with people like Georges Callas in Barcelona who says, you need people on those spectrums, so that there is a decent struggle over whatever happens, and that sometimes, saying that environmentalism is sustainable development or, is just not good enough. We need a stronger and more, at least the voice of a more radical change for us to start to negotiate from. I guess it's my personal position.
I don't like being categorized, David. So sometimes the solutions require laying the groundwork much earlier, like focusing on something different. One of my former bosses, this was 10 years ago, and she worried that as she said, I don't know if we have enough time to create the trust we need to come up with solutions. Like to her point, the solutions come second, but if you don't have the trust between your allies, between your friends, between scientists and the public, you're just going to be shooting in the dark, and it doesn't matter. And that's why I focused on that on the slide. You have people who are deliberately promoting mistrust because that's useful for them politically, and that's actually something I've written about. Because when people talk about disasters, they're rarely natural. And that's a critique that people like Ilan Kelman has said for years. But we went beyond that because we realized that oftentimes disasters are created, they're manufactured, that people actually deliberately undermine the resilience of a society, or they deliberately target energy or environmental underpinnings of a society in order to undercut those societies. And the simplest example being in the Bosnian War, most of the landmines that were laid, and there were millions of them, weren't meant to hurt people. They could, of course, but it was meant to cut off agricultural land, and it was meant to prevent communities from rebuilding. And so oftentimes these environmental solutions require looking at different things, not just the environment itself, not just don't look at just, maybe I'm a rationalist because I have to lead a policy-making program, but people are often focusing on the wrong things.
Similarly, dealing with migration, it's not even usually about migrants or migration or necessarily having a migration policy to better manage migrants, but considering how they impact on all other sectors. And so I am a fan of incremental changes in the sense that when discussing with policymakers, it's really usually the only productive way to move a conversation forward by linking it into something that they usually do care about, and it's usually not migrants whatsoever. So finding inroads to create allies to work with is essentially how I would approach and how I do approach my work. So that involves convening, and it involves finding common ground. And it involves having to live with phrases like sustainable development as well.
Well, that's a great place for us to end on. We're right on time, so I want to say thank you to the speakers, thank you to the audience. Thank you.